We good? All right. Afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, class. Welcome to Sadler's Creek, everybody. I think I've met all of you before. If not, I'm Brett. I'm the winemaker here at Sadler's Creek. Mind you, with all the craziness of COVID going on, winemaking is a very loose term at the moment because there's so many of you wonderful people coming to the cellar door that we tend to spend more time out there than in here. But that's okay because that means we're sharing our wares with lots of people and hopefully you're enjoying it. We've got a number of different wines to have a look at this afternoon as part of the release of our top shelf collection that we're releasing to our Equus members now, today, this afternoon. This is the official launch. Woo! So we've got a number of different wines that we've pulled out of the cellar, some of which that we have two parts of bugger all of. So there's a couple of wines on this tasting that are not part of that campaign that we release to the rest of our Club Equus members. They are wines that we only...
Because otherwise no one can hear you at home.
They can hear.
No, but the people at home can't hear.
Can they hear now? All right. So there's a couple of wines that we only have a handful of bottles left of. One of those is the Mystery Red that we're going to have a look at today. I'd encourage, if anyone has any questions about anything at all, feel free to direct those questions to Deb and she can sort you out. So, shall we kick off? Cool. All right, so we've got 6 wines in front of you today and they all range from... They all range from 2018, so our current or brand new release Bluegrass Cabernet, all the way back to 1995. Now, if you want to make some of you feel a little bit old, I was only in year 1 when that wine came out or was made, so it's got a couple of years on it. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at these 6 different wines and compare them by varietal and age. But the idea with the top shelf collection is not just a collection of wines that are young or just old, it's a collection of wines that are really good drinking right now. Because when you think of the top shelf collection in a bar or something to that effect, it's not necessarily just one style of product, it is a collection of products that are really enjoyable right now in your glass. So what we're going to do is start with the wine right at the top far left-hand corner, the 2013 Reserve Shiraz, and we're going to go from there. Now, has anyone got, before we go any further, has anyone got any questions at all at the moment? I'd hope not, because we haven't done anything. A few formalities just for everyone. Obviously, most of you, I can only assume every one of you have been here to the cellar door before. Bathrooms you'll find through the glass doors down to the right. So if you need to use those, please feel free to pop out that way. As known, everyone will have checked in when you got here, and do us a favour, everyone must remain seated while we're conducting the tasting unless you're going to the bathroom. So that's just the regulations we have at the moment. So Nathan, no disco dancing or anything like that. Actually, has anyone come from Melbourne? Because if you have, get out. All right, we're all good on that front. Okay, so first wine, top left-hand corner, is our 2013 Reserve Shiraz. Now, Shiraz is the most widely planted red grape variety in Australia, and it's by far the most widely planted grape variety or red grape variety here in the Hunter Valley. This wine is made from fruit sourced 100% from Langhorne Creek in South Australia. It came from a vineyard that used to be known as the Kirklington Vineyard. It's now called Angus River, and it used to be owned by Di Davidson, who was involved with the Grape Wine Research Institute, Wine Australia and those sorts of things. So it's quite a quintessential vineyard down in that area. Excuse me. That was a non-COVID cough, by the way. The vineyard at Angus River, as the name suggests, is situated next to a river. The soil itself is quite sandy, and then it also has this nice, rich red strip up the vineyard as well. It doesn't get a huge amount of rain like the rest of Langhorne Creek. The good thing about it as a growing region is it's relatively dry throughout the growing season. So when you're coming into the harvest period down south, so into March, and April. It tends to be quite dry, so you can hang your fruit for a long time. You end up with quite big, bold, intense fruit characters. Whereas if you compare just as a style to what we get here in the Hunter Valley is more a medium-bodied red wine producing region, and that stems from our climate that we have here. We tend to get late summer rain, so late January, early February. You can pretty much look at your calendar and bank on the fact that it's going to rain at some stage, and that changes our viticultural practices, and it also changes the wines that we produce. So if we use the Hunter Valley as an example, you'd be getting lighter, more medium-bodied styles of wines, a little bit more savoury, whereas if you look into places like Langhorne Creek, they're quite big and juicy and voluptuous. They can be sort of big and cuddly wines. So you'll see that across these wines that we have this afternoon, because the bulk of them are from that region. So we'll start with the Reserve Shiraz. It's 100% 2013 Shiraz, 100% off the Kirklington vineyard. It came off two blocks, the K1, the K2 block. What's the difference? Nothing really. There was just a road between the two. I remember this vintage, the berries in the vineyard were exceedingly small. The weather down there had been quite dry, so we had fruit that produced these more ball-bearing style grapes. Are really, really tiny, and what you get from that is intense flavour and intense colour. So we're seeing in this wine quite a lot of spice, quite a lot of fruit. It's not primary fresh cherries and strawberries that you'll see in a 1 or 2 year old wine. It is starting to go into those secondary characters and showing a little bit of that sort of smoked meat or charcuterie board character, and the oak stands out as well. So you're seeing very much that fresh cut timber and then moving into cigar box character. Give it a whirl if you haven't already. Now, all of these wines were only opened just before pouring, opposed to the Magnum. The Magnum we have decanted this wine for about 45 minutes to an hour. But what we're going to do is when we get to that wine, I'm going to open another one and we'll pour that, and we'll see the difference of how this wine has either benefited or not. We'll find out when we get there, because decanting is no hard and fast rule. It is very much a process that changes each individual wine, and it can be a good thing or it can be a bad thing. What did we think of the Shiraz, guys? Like it? Very much leaning towards something that you need half a slab of cow for. It's very much a protein style wine because it is bigger and gregarious. It displays a lot of that spice. It's got quite a lot of tannin. It is a wine that you could cellar for a period of time. So you could put this back in the cellar for another 5 or 6 years easily without hesitation. It's got plenty of body. There is plenty of back structure to this wine. So don't be hesitant if you have some of this sitting around at home, then you can keep it in the cellar for a period. All right. Shall we move on? What we're going to do now is we're going to look at the Cabernet Shiraz, so the one at the top in the middle, and then we're going to go through the Cabernets, the 3 wines at the front, but we'll go from youngest to oldest. And the reason for this is Shiraz tends to be a more fruit-forward style of wine. Cabernet tends to be big, round, rich style, but it can also be what we call a donut variety. A donut variety is where the fruit structure of the wine gives you this circular sensation in the mouth, and the middle of the palate can actually be hollow or relatively empty. And that's why you'd see a lot of wines on the market, Cabernet Merlot, Cabernet Shiraz, something to that effect, because what we do is we use front and mid-palate weighted varieties like Shiraz and Merlot to plug up that hole. And that's what we did with this wine at the top. So the 2012 Equus Collection Series 12 Cab Shiraz. From memory, it's about 80% Cabernet, 20% Shiraz. It's all from Langhorne Creek in South Australia. The Equus Collection wines are built to be, what's the best way to describe it? They're never made to be the epitome of what we make each vintage. They're meant to be one-off productions of exceedingly good wine that we know our members will like, but you may never see it again. So we've had some may call odd styles in there before. A Semillon Sauvignon Blanc of all things, where the Semillon came from the Hunter Valley and the Sauvignon Blanc came from the Margaret River. We've had Hunter Valley Chardonnay, pretty good staple for this area. Hunter Valley Shiraz, Cabernet, Langhorne Creek Cabernet, McLaren Vale Shiraz, you name it, there's been quite a lot of different variances. And with the Series 12, we decided to go down the route of Cabernet Shiraz. So what we get is you tend to get the herbaceous character and the blueberries, the black currants nature of Cabernet, and then you marry with that the spiciness, the red spectrum fruits of strawberries and raspberries, and the spiciness of the Shiraz merge together, and you tend to plug up that hole. Definitely a food wine. Something like a Cabernet Shiraz tends to be really versatile. You can put it with pizzas, pastas, those sorts of things, or again, a heavy protein dish if you want. Moving into lamb tends to work really well because the slightly herbaceous nature of Cabernet can suit really, really well with lamb that you tend to serve with things like mint sauce and those sorts of things. So only slightly older than the 13 Shiraz that you saw, but it's actually a little bit more delicate. It's the softer of the two wines. You can certainly see the mid-palate softened in this wine. It's certainly not big and spicy like the first one. And this is more of a cuddle-up wine that you might open, leave in the glass for a little while and just drink by itself. Whereas I think the Shiraz in this lineup between these two wines, this is crying out for food, this is crying out to be drunk as it is. What do we think? Do we agree with that? Disagree? You're allowed to disagree. All right, then let's get into straight Cabernet, which is the three wines at the front. And we're going to try these wines side by side. And what I'm going to get you to do is I'd like you to try the wines from youngest to oldest, and then I'd like you to go back the other way. But most importantly, one of the most obvious things you'll see in this lineup of these three wines is the change in colour. Now, the first two wines at the front of the list, the 2018 and the 2008 Bluegrass Cabernet, were sourced from the same vineyard in Langhorne Creek in South Australia, whereas the 95 from memory, if I have my facts correct, if it doesn't say it on the back, then my facts are right, because it doesn't. That's good, you can't tell me I'm wrong. The 94 and the 95 Bluegrass Cabernet was actually sourced from the Hunter Valley, so this is the odd one out in the lineup. They're also one, it's a lot older and stored in a magnum, but it was also matured in oak for a much shorter period of time, but more new oak. So what we have here is the younger bluegrass wine from 2018. It's all from Langhorne Creek. It's been in a mixture of new and old oak, but about 25% of that is new, and they're the barrels that you see scattered around the winery here. Now, we use three different sized barrels for our winemaking production. We use barriques, which are the size of the barrels at the first row down here. They hold 225 litres. We have hogsheads, which there's a stack over near the roller door and the press here. They hold 300 litres, and you may have seen some when you came in the door, or there's some in the back corner. And we have puncheons, which are 500 litres. Now, with Cabernet, because it's quite a gregarious varietal, we tend to use more smaller format oak, so barriques, whereas with our Shiraz or our Merlot or Tempranillo, for example, we'll start to move towards larger format oak, like hogsheads. And if we're doing Hunter Valley Shiraz, we've started playing with puncheons as well. And the reason for that is the larger the barrel, it means the surface area of timber to wine is less, so therefore you're getting a softer, more elegant style of wine rather than a big muscly sort of boxer style. But it really depends on what you're trying to produce. There is no hard and fast rule on what is better or what is worse. It really depends on the wine you're trying to get out the other end, and I guess what the fruit was that you're putting in at the front end as well. 2018, quite dry vintage down in Langhorne Creek. It's very vibrant in colour. If you look at it over a white piece of paper, you'll see that there's this really purple hue to this wine. It is only relatively young. It's only been in the bottle since December last year, so it hasn't been in glass for a huge amount of time. But now being, what are we, nearly the end of July, 6 months after bottling, these wines start to come out of their shell. We do find that if we bottle a wine and hook into it too quickly, so within the first 4 weeks, the wines will show bottle shock, and they just look a bit flat and a bit boring. But if you let your wine sit for a period of time, they will start to come out of their shell. That same theory applies if you're shipping wine around the country. So it is really important when you receive deliveries from us or anybody else that you don't hook into the wine as soon as it arrives, because it will go through a bit of travel shock, and this is exacerbated if you're taking wine internationally or in a plane. So next time you've been to the airport, you get your luggage out underneath of a plane, you've probably forgotten how this works. The last 6 months no one's been allowed to do anything. If you've flown internationally and you go to your checked luggage, it's always really cold because the storage hold of aircraft is not heated or cooled. So when it's flying at a squillion thousand feet, the temperature in there is only a few degrees. So your wine gets chilled very rapidly during that period. And at the other end, it will come out a bit shocked. So next time you buy some duty-free vino at the other side of the world and then bring it back, wait a couple of weeks before you drink it, because you'll reap the rewards by doing that. So the first Cabernet, you'll see it's quite fruit-driven, quite easy to drink. It displays a lot of upfront fruit character, but it has this rushing, engulfing amount of tannin coming from the back palate. It's really quite chewy. You might feel like you need a knife and fork to get through this wine. There's a good example of young Cabernet that's been in quite a selection of new oak at 25 to 30%. Definitely a food or cellaring style, because that tannin structure is quite intense. It's really driving that wine down the palate. The middle wine we have is from 2008. Now this wine screams Cabernet in the glass. It has that real stereotypical Cabernet herbaceous character. Some Cabernet wines, especially if they're grown in a cooler climate, so if you look at places like the Coonawarra or Margaret River, or if you're getting Cabernet even out of Tasmania, they do grow a little bit down there, you tend to get this increased herbaceous note, so that sort of fresh cut tomato leaf, cut tomatoes or capsicum note in the wine. They're called pyrazines and they come from the skin of the grape, and they're exactly the same thing that you get in tomato leaves. Now, while the nose of that wine is very herbaceous, the palate is quite chocolatey. It's quite rich. Oak certainly follows through on the back palate, but you'll see that the tannin structure is starting to soften in that wine. It's certainly not a big knife and fork style. You can drink it by itself. It shows more vibrant mid-palate weight as those tannins on the back palate have started to soften. Did we have a preference over one or the other between those two wines? 08. Did anyone have a preference for the young wine? No? Deb? We get to keep all of that because they didn't like it. All right, then we're going to move to the last glass.
Sorry, we do have a question from Greg. He wants to know how the 18 compares to the 17.
How does the 18 Bluegrass Cabernet compare to the 2017 Bluegrass Cabernet? The 18 is a more gregarious wine than the 2017. I would be tempted to sell my 18 and drink my 17 if you had to choose between the two. Alternatively, buy a case of each and do half and half. There's the inner sales person in me. All right, now go to the last glass on the right-hand side. The 1995 Bluegrass Cabernet was made in a different vein or a different production method than these two. It was sourced from the Hunter Valley, which is very, very rare for Cabernet. You don't see a huge amount of vineyards in this area that grow Cab. It was also put into all new oak, but for a shorter period of time. So what we tend to do with our production these days is we sit anywhere between 12 and 24 months of oak maturation, depending on what we're trying to achieve year in, year out. And we find the balance tends to be about 20 to 25% new oak suits this style. If you go into our reserve wine, so our Alessandro reserve style, then you'll see that the oak regime on those wines goes up to about 50% new oak. You have to have the fruit structure to carry the oak. There's no point just putting a huge amount of oak influence on the wine if the fruit's not going to carry it. What we find in this style of wine from 1995, with the fruit grown from the Hunter Valley, it is a little bit more medium-bodied to start with, but much shorter oak maturation, only about 6 to 8 months, but all in new barrels. So you're getting a short, sharp burst of oak influence into the wine, but by doing it over a shorter period of time, you retain the fresh fruity character of that grape variety and then into bottle. Now, the advantage we've seen in this wine is the fact that it was packaged in magnums and been laying down its whole life, which is how these wines should be stored. The magnum will slow down the maturation of the wine. So, can you pass me a 750ml bottle, please, Deb? Thank you very much. With the small format, the standard format bottle versus a magnum, the key is the amount of ullage or air pocket in the top of the bottle. They're exactly the same. So what you're exposing the wine to in a large format is half as much air, so it allows the wine to cellar over a longer period of time, just by the nature of having more wine in the bottle. You could go to the next step and get Jeroboams and all of those sorts of things, and your wines will age slower. The only problem is the bigger the bottle, the more you have to drink in one hit when you open it. So, damn. It's not so great if you're the only person, but if you've got a group, then it's all okay. So this wine here, you'll notice as we've gone along, the colour has gone in the young wine from this vibrant purple coloured wine. In the middle, we're starting to go into somewhat brick red sort of natured wine, and then the last wine, it's starting to throw that somewhat brown hue around the edge. So just by looking at the colour, this 1995 wine is starting to get to the end of its life, but the good thing about this wine is it's damn yummy. So it's drinking really, really well. So the technical terms are really important, like yummy, yummy, get in my tummy. It's very important. So you don't see as much of that herbaceous nature in this wine as you do in the middle. You're starting to see a lot of secondary characters like that cigar box, the nuttiness in the wine. But there's still this drive of black currant and plum in the background. A little bit more sort of stewed fruit character, the nature of the age of the wine. It's certainly not jumping out of the glass with bright, fresh fruit characters as you would expect from a young wine, but it has this lovely chocolate nature to it. Now, the lovely thing about this style of wine is it's so soft and silky. There's hardly any tannin structure left in this wine. It doesn't have that bitter chewiness that you see in the young wines, and that's purely the nature of cellaring. So what happens is the anthocyanins, which are the molecule of tannins, they all join together. They make these mega tannins. Sort of like Power Rangers getting together. They're called, it shows my age right there. They're called, Nathan understood it. He got it. Why don't they just do that at the start of the show? Would have been so much quicker. We digress. What happens is those tannins, they join together. We call them elagotannins or a megatannin, and they drop out a solution and they'll form a crust within the bottle. Now, the other thing you'll notice in this older wine is it is slightly cloudy. A couple of reasons. One, because these wines were laying down, the crust has been disturbed when we've stood them back up, but they also haven't been as finely filtered as the young wines. So these very youthful wines, like the ones from 2018, have been put through quite modern filtering technology called crossflow filters, where it removes all microbial spoilage agents, things like that, bacteria, and obviously any solids. Whereas these older wines, if they were filtered, would have been put through either an earth or a pad filter, which is coarser. So you do leave some solids floating around, and over a period of time that will form a crust and give you a bit of cloudiness in the wine. Won't hurt you, it just might look a bit odd if there's plenty of it in there.
Brad, I have a question for you.
Yeah, mate.
The 95 Cabernet
Mm-hmm.
had it for the first time in May last year.
Yep.
Bluegrass. It tastes very similar, and I think I've put 3, I've had 2, and they haven't changed much. So is there a point when wine drinks won't change anymore? So I think last year you said that this wine had probably 12 months, 6 to 12 months to go, but clearly it's going to be very similar to what it was
Yeah, good question, Nathan. So the question was, Nathan first tried this wine about 12, 18 months ago, and his recollection was it tasting basically exactly the same. Has the wine plateaued, and is it going to get any better? I would agree with that. I don't think this wine is going to get any better. There's a couple of indicators for that. One, the colour. So we're not seeing any of that bright red or purple character in the wine anymore. The tannin structure of the wine is it is certainly softened. It's very silky and round. They're the nature characters that indicate, hey, drink me. Most wines, depending on how they're cellared, they'll hang around in that band for anywhere between 12 to 24 months. As the wine gets older, you run the risk of cork failure, so oxidation and things like that. So my tip is, if you like it, drink it. Because it's always better to drink a wine too early and think, wow, you know what, that wine's great, I could have cellared it for 12 months longer. On the flip side, it's terrible to open a bottle of wine and go, oh, that tasted like crap, I should have drunk it 12 months beforehand. So, yes, I think the nature of the beast of this wine is still sitting in that plateau where it's just drinking so elegantly and fruit-driven now. The next step is it's going to start to show oxidation, and it will be the end of that wine's life. So I'd suggest hooking in. Question?
Other than the ear and the neck,
Yes.
is there any way of telling, like standard bottle, magnum bottle, thin bottle, is there any other way of telling that I'm ready to be drunk now?
Okay, so the question was, is there any way to determine from looking at a bottle of wine whether it's ready to be drunk now? If you've got a corkscrew in your hand and an empty wine glass, generally the answer is yes. With white wines, it can be quite obvious because a lot of white wine gets bottled in either clear or lightly coloured glass, and you can hold the wine up to the light to see what colour that wine is, because as white wine gets older, it goes from being quite light in colour to quite dark in colour. Now, there's inherently in all wines a level of dissolved oxygen within that wine that allows that wine to age over time. Now, the disadvantage of cork within a bottle is that you're introducing a variable and no two corks are the same, whereas with screw cap, they're very, very consistent. Sure, they're a man-made product, they may vary, so they won't be 100% perfect, but they're 99.999%. Whereas with cork, you will see a much higher fluctuation, and in the 90s we saw anywhere up to about a 10 to 15% failure rate with corks, and that's when there was a huge shift away from cork into screw caps in the late 80s, early 90s. So with white wines, you would have seen a lot of oxidation, and that colour change would be very much the indicator. The other ones with corks is leakage. So if you've got your wines in a cellar and you have a look at the end of the cork, a lot of the time they're either got wax or they've got a metal capsule over the top. What you can do is just cut the top capsule off and leave it in your wine rack so the end of the cork is exposed, so that you can see if there's been any leakage up the cork.
That would affect the wine if you take that metal cap.
No, not at all. The metal cap's only there to make it look pretty. It's a marketing, it's dressing it up really at the end of the day. It doesn't stop anything. Wax will help because it'll stop the cork from wanting to move, but your general capsule will have very little influence. The good thing then is you can see if there's been any seepage, because if your cork has started to leak, that means what's happened is the bottle has warmed up and the liquid on the inside has expanded and then gone either around the cork or through the cork, and then when there's something going out, something's got to come in. So as the wine went out, air came in, and then that's increasing the amount of available oxygen within that bottle to destroy it. With reds, as they get older, and as you've seen in this lineup, the colour goes the other way. It's very hard to colour sort red wines because the glass is so dark. So you can see some indication of spoilage, but really at the end of the day, the only way to find out is to open the bottle. So some varieties will sell better than others. So if you think about white wines, for example, Semillon, Chardonnay, Riesling, those either very light, linear, acidic styles like Semillon or Riesling, or the quite gregarious styles like Chardonnay, they will sell very well. Things like Verdelho or Sauvignon Blanc, they should have been drunk probably before they were even put on a bottle shop shelf, because the nature of that style is you want them fruit forward and easy to drink. They're not a style that would sell very well. Red wines, things like Cabernet, Shiraz, they tend to have enough grunt, enough tannin to allow them to cellar for a long period of time. Other styles like Pinot Noir or Merlot, they tend to be much softer and silkier, so they don't tend to cellar as long, but there's certainly no hard and fast rules. There is some amazing wines out there that will outlive lots of us a lot longer than you'd ever imagine. So, well, might outlive everyone. There might be a lot of wine going cheap in the next 12 months. Did that answer your question in a roundabout way? It did? No worries. Has anyone else got any questions so far?
Yeah, Brett, you talked about the others.
Yes.
And it just made me think, so why doesn't everybody bring one close to the top of the, and just have no others? With no.
Why not create no ullage? Yeah. Sure, it's all to do with storage. So if we fill the wine all the way to the top, couple of things. One, we'd be selling you more wine than we actually put in the label. So we've got to make money, mate. We don't want to give you too much. But mainly it's due to temperature variation, especially in places like Australia where the temperature can vary so much, anywhere from negative through to 40 degrees. When that wine heats up and expands, the wine pushes on the capsule and it can rupture. Even a screw cap can rupture. It's been built with a burst pressure behind it. So one thing to be very, very careful with is wine in your car in summertime. You've all heard the analogy or the story about don't leave your kids or your dogs in the car or leave the window down. Don't leave your wine in the car either, because it will heat up and the wine will expand and it'll push on the capsule and it will destroy the seal, and 10 years later when you whip it out of your cellar you'll find you're very disappointed. So that's the reason why. Hey Deb.
Can we do this last one and we'll do Q&A at the end, because I'll get Rob to take the mic around and we can do it that way if you want.
Yep, we've got one wine to go, which is the Mystery Rare Red. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to get you to vacate one of your glasses, because we'll open up the other Magnum and see whether decanting was a good or a bad idea for that wine. So the Mystery Red at the top right hand corner, lucky I know what it is. There is a commonality in this wine between the 5 wines on the table, and I'd like you to tell me what those are. There's 3 things in common. It's red and it's aged. Shall we start with vintage or year? So I've had a wine all the way from 2018, I've had a wine all the way to 1995. Which of these vintages that you already have in front of you is this particular wine? 2008, I've heard. 8. Anyone for any other vintage? 12. Anyone else? 8's the winners. 2008, correct. Now it's quite generous, this wine. Displays a lot of chocolate, spice.
But very different to the other 2008.
Very different to the other 2008, yep, I'd agree with that. Is it bigger than the other wine or is it softer? It tastes bigger, yep. Sorry, say that again. It's Equus Collection? Oh, never know. We'll find out. Okay, what variety do we think it is? Cabernet? Straight Cabernet or a blend of? Blend? Cab Merlot? It's 100% Cabernet from 2008. Now, does anyone want to have a stab at what label of ours this wine was released under? Sadler's Creek. Smart ass. I bet that guy's from Victoria. Shouldn't have let him across the border. Shall we take a punt? So we have the Bluegrass label. We have the Classic label that was around in 2008. It's not around anymore. Our Reserve label, our Equus Collection, or our Chrome label. Reserve, Chrome, Equus. Anyone want to have an advancement on any of those? Chrome's the answer on this one. So Chrome is a wine that most of you have probably never seen before. It was Chrome. No, the commonalities was the vintage and variety. Oh yeah, and region. It came from Langhorne Creek. Hold on, I just got to get it undressed. You poking me in the back? So the Chrome was released as part of the Equus collection, so I guess partial credit for he or she who said the Equus collection. This was released back in 2008. It was an anniversary wine for Sadler's Creek. And it's pretty yummy. What do you think? So this was produced from a small portion of Langhorne Creek Cabernet that was to be utilised for our reserve cab, but it was a smaller make. About 150 cases, I believe, was made for this wine. And the cellaring, according to the back of the label, is 10 plus years. And I reckon at 12 years old, it is holding up every part of that 10 plus years. It's more chocolate than the 08 Bluegrass. I don't see that herbaceous character that we see in this wine. I'd take a punt that this wine came off a vineyard or a block of grapes that had a much smaller canopy, so the fruit was able to get riper. I'd take a punt that the other wine was off a more gregarious growing vineyard where you get a little bit more shading, and that tends to encourage that herbaceous nature in the wine. So it was a one-off label for, yes, it was part of the 18th birthday celebrations for Sadler's Creek. So Sadler's was officially started in 1990, but they had made some wines from 89, so there's sort of grey area. 2008 was 18 years since, so it was released as part of those celebrations.
I've got another question. Back on your Magnum
Yep.
thing.
Yep.
Less air, get of wine, makes it better, blah, blah, blah. Does that stand up to whites? No.
So the question was, is there an advantage in cellaring wines in magnums for white wines as well? Yes, 100%. So it doesn't matter what the wine product is when it comes to aging products. So table wines, ignore fortified wines like brandies, ports and sherries and things like that. That's a very different kettle of fish because they don't actually change much in the bottle unless it's a vintage port style. But for table wines, Semillon, Riesling, Chardonnay and red wines, the larger the bottle, the better. Because you don't have to get up as many times to open another bottle. Yeah. Size does matter. All right, what we might do is I'll put this mic down, I'll open this other bottle, and while I'm doing this, Deb might pop around and see if anyone has any other questions, yeah? I've turned it off for a second. Oh, that one.
Down the bell. All right. Has anyone got any questions? Questions? Anyone down here got any questions?
Okay, so Robin's going to pop around. If anyone has any other questions, she's got a little microphone in hand. Make it easy, then I don't have to repeat myself.
All righty. Did you have a question?
No.
No? Come on, mate. Sing out. Have a question. Come on, ask him something silly. No one. No one got any questions. Terrible. Terrible. No one wants to talk to you, Brett. Come on, Rach, ask him a question. Can you drive us home?
Yeah.
That's
Are you
what
the
we're gonna ask
taxi?
you.
Who's the taxi?
Because we are at the Australia.
Can do that.
Don't have any questions for Brett.
Good on you, Pete.
No worries. Brett, got a question. The alcohol. I'm just curious about the alcohol difference between the 208s wines.
Okay, so the question was, what's the alcohol difference between the two 2008 wines? And as I suspected, I have no bloody clue. And the reason I say that is because both wines are labelled as 14.5% alcohol. Now, does anyone, not you Pete, because you might know, does anyone know what the legal tolerance for alcohol labelling is in Australia for wines, table wines? Does anyone want to take a punt? So if we put on the label that it's 14.5% alcohol within that wine, how much variance either way do you think we're allowed? 1%? 0.5%? Anyone want to have an advancement on 1%? 1.5%? 1.5% is the correct answer. So here in Australia, we're allowed a variance of 1.5%. So on the back of the label, if it says 14.5, it can be as low as 13.1 and as high as 15.9 without having to change that back label. It allows variances in bottlings, because imagine the big guys where they have really big tanks, then they would do different blending bottling runs, and the variance of the wine could change quite dramatically. Now 1.5% is huge, but hey, that's the rules. Within the EU, it's 0.8%. So reading the alcohol on the back of the bottle tells you actually very little. Sorry? 0.8% for the EU, for the European Union. Some countries are tighter than that, but most, like China's 1%, Australia's 1.5%, EU's 0.8%, they're the mainstays. Yeah, correct. I would think there's not much difference in those two wines. I think it's more just the structure of the two of them. They would have been harvested at a very similar time. I more noticed the difference between those two wines, that herbaceous nature showing in the bluegrass wine versus the chrome, which leads me to think that, well, one, the chrome was probably riper, so there may be more alcohol in that wine, but that's not to say that's true. It may just be the nature that it actually ripened to more fruit structure versus sugar. So if we export to a certain country, you must have your labels modified to adhere to those rules. Otherwise, it won't go through customs. So depending on the country, some of them you may have seen in the UK, you have to have the little pregnancy image. That's the same in parts of the EU. Depending on the country it's going to, you may have to have certain declarations. They may have to be in certain languages. So certain countries will say that you have to have it in English and Spanish, for example. Yeah, it's actually a new rule that's coming in at the moment. It's just gone through the Food Standards Board that in Australia we will have to put labelling on the back of the wine bottle to say, hey, drinking when you're pregnant's not such a flash idea. I beg to differ because I'm living proof that that's not quite true. Mum will probably watch this, but she knows it's true. She drank a lot when she was pregnant with me. And I became a winemaker. So, worse things could happen. Please speak to your general practitioner for real advice. Okay, who wants to pour this? Okay, so we have the same wine coming around. You should have vacated a glass. We have the other Magnum of 1995 to have a quick look at. And then it'll be time to go and eat some food. Okay, ladies and gents. So the next wine that's coming around is exactly the same as the 1995 Magnum that we opened before. It's just a different bottle. And It has not been decanted, it's just been opened and poured into your glass. And this is a really good exercise to see how these wines develop over time when exposed to air. Before you try the wine that Robin's bringing around, I'd implore you go back and try the wine that's sitting in front of you. Too late, already gone. You all drank it. Does anyone have any left? If you do, go back and try it. I'd be intrigued to know what you think. It's big difference? Yeah, exactly. So what we've seen here with the wine that was decanted and sat in the glass for the last 40 minutes or so, it's now been exposed to oxygen for anywhere between an hour and a half and an hour and 45 minutes. And it's actually starting to go the other direction. It's starting to jump off the cliff of too much air. It's not as pretty as that wine was 20 minutes ago. It's starting to look a bit flabby and lifeless. Whereas the wine that's just been poured into your glass, you can start to see that sort of bright fruit character again. So all we're looking at here, of course there'll be a little bit of bottle variance, but these wines were bottled at the same time on the same day. They have been stored in the same conditions next to each other for the last 20 odd years. The difference here we're seeing is time in the glass and time with air. So the sweet spot for this wine is probably open and leave in the glass, I would think, for half an hour as a small volume, or 20 minutes as a small volume versus decanting. But there's no, as I said, no hard and fast rule, and there's only one way to find out, and this was a great way of exploring that. So the new wine that's in front of you, it's got more fresh fruit character, as the other wine has started to dip and start to show a little bit of age. All right, that pretty much concludes our tasting this afternoon. Does anyone else have any other questions about any of these wines or any other wines in general? You're more than welcome to ask, even if you think it's a silly question. No? We're good? Yeah, question?
The mystery wine.
The mystery wine, yes?
They seem to have a lot more spice in it than most Cabernets.
Yeah. I think just probably the vineyard selection for that wine, purely going off the other 08 Bluegrass, or the Bluegrass Cabernet that was near that, it was more herbaceous, whereas this was more gregarious and chocolatey. It may have a little bit of Shiraz in it to give that pepper character, but I would think it's just fruit selection more than anything else. It certainly didn't show lots of raspberry and strawberry that you would expect from Shiraz, and it wasn't covered in white pepper either. It was just a bit more generous. There is a few bottles of that 08 Chrome left, and you may stand in a 1.5 metre distanced line, and we can more than happily help you out. All right. Hello, Deb.
Hello. We're going to conclude our Facebook live stream now.
Sounds good.
But if people would like to join us on the weekend at Sadler's Creek Wines, we have ribs and reds available, and you can book your top shelf flight. We're actually featuring the new release wines, and we'll have a couple of back vintage wines that we've tried here today. So they can jump on our website and book the ribs and reds top shelf tasting and the beautiful ribs that we're about to all enjoy. So thank you.
Cool. Before we depart, purely for those watching at home, the lineup of wines for our top shelf ribs and reds collection is slightly different to the wines that you've had here this afternoon. The 95 Magnum, for example, we have only a handful of those left, so opening those for every tasting, as you can imagine, they disappear pretty quickly. However, if someone would like to purchase them, they are available. Dollar value? Really, really, really expensive. I'll find out, I'll get back to you. All right, it's time to eat some food. So for those of you who have ordered your ribs, we'll organise those outside. Thank you very much for everyone attending this afternoon. For everyone that's been watching online, thank you very much. Next time, what's on next week, Deb?
We've got brisket and
Brisket.
yeah, with some more reds.
Brisket and booze and brisket. Sounds good. All right. Bluegrass and brisket. That sounds more like it. All right, we'll catch you next week, guys.